Robert Nozick. If you mention the topic of libertarianism to anyone with pretensions to a liberal education, you're likely to elicit, you mean that book by Nozick, what's its name again, Anarchy something or other. And there lies the problem. On the one hand, Nozick made the topic of libertarianism academically visible and gave it a veneer of academic respectability in Cambridge, Massachusetts and other important places. But the very fact that he occupies the libertarian foreground for most people means that he has made it well nigh impossible for them to see anything standing behind him. And concealed behind him stands almost everything of libertarian interest. That's not to say that Anarchy, State and Utopia isn't interesting. It is, and clever, and controversial, and engagingly written in a masterly self-deprecating style. Nozick was one of those annoying people we've all known who have more good ideas before mid-morning coffee than most of us have in a year. But Anarchy, State and Utopia is not the only significant work in libertarian literature. Its publication in 1974 created something of a sensation in the normally sedate world of academic philosophy. Here we had a Harvard philosopher defending a form of libertarianism when libertarianism of any kind is a position which your average liberal academic reflexively considers about as attractive as an Ebola sandwich. I believe that Eric Mack understates the position when he remarks that Anarchy, State and Utopia shocked the philosophical world with its robust and sophisticated defence of the minimal state. To the majority of the largely liberal academic community, Nozick's book must have seemed an egregious case of willfully defending the indefensible. In addition to Anarchy, State and Utopia, for which he is best known, Nozick published other significant books: Philosophical Explanations in 1981, The Examined Life in 1989, and The Nature of Rationality in 1993. This was joined by Socratic Puzzles in 1997 and Invariances in 2001. However, I think it fair to say that whatever the merits of these later works, they are overshadowed by the notoriety of Anarchy, State and Utopia. Nozick must have felt like some composers such as Ravel with his Bolero and Barber with his Adagio for strings, in being simultaneously gratified and frustrated by the fame of just one particular work to the virtual obliteration of all their others. Despite Murray Rothbard's direct and immediate personal influence on many central figures in contemporary libertarianism, and his direct, if mediated, influence on very many others by means of his scholarly and popular publications, his most significant influence on contemporary academic discussions of political thought has been uncharacteristically indirect. Nozick credits his interest in libertarianism to a long conversation he had with Rothbard sometime in the late 1960s. He writes, "It was a long conversation about 6 years ago with Murray Rothbard that stimulated my interest in individualist anarchist theory." Eric Mack writes, "The major force in his conversion to libertarian views was his conversations at Princeton with his fellow philosophy graduate student Bruce Goldberg. It was through Goldberg that Nozick met the economist Murray Rothbard. Nozick's encounter with Rothbard and Rothbard's rights-based critique of the state led Nozick to the project of formulating a rights-based libertarianism that would vindicate the minimal state. Despite this explicit acknowledgement of Rothbard's influence, Rothbard's actual writings on libertarianism aren't directly discussed in the actual text of Anarchy, State and Utopia, his intellectual presence being confined to just a few minor footnotes. Nozick starts off Anarchy, State and Utopia with a bang. Individuals have rights, he says, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. So strong and far-reaching are these rights that they raise the question of what, if anything, the state and its officials may do. How much room do individual rights leave for the state?" That's Nozick's starting point. His conclusion will be that a minimal state, limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, and so on, is justified. That any more extensive state will violate persons' rights not to be forced to do certain things and is unjustified. and that the minimal state is inspiring as well as right. Nozick's project, then, is to justify a neo-Lockean night watchman state, a state with very narrowly circumscribed responsibilities. He specifically denies that the state can be used for paternalistic purposes or for coerced charity. If Nozick was reticent about explicitly discussing Rothbard did not return the compliment. One of the most scintillating sections of The Ethics of Liberty is a chapter entitled Robert Nozick and the Immaculate Conception of the State. Building on the work of Roy Childs and Rennie Barnett, Rothbard subjects the central thesis of Anarchy, State and Utopia to a withering criticism. His summary of its central thesis is succinct. It is, he says, an invisible hand variant of a Lockean contractarian attempt to justify the state, or at least a minimal state, confined to the function of protection. Rothbard outlines the steps in Nozick's thesis as follows. Beginning with the free market anarchist state of nature, Nozick portrays the state as emerging by an invisible hand process that violates no one's rights, first as a dominant protective agency, then to an ultra-minimal state, and then finally to a minimal state. If Nozick's account of the necessary and inevitable emergence of the state from a condition of anarchy by means of libertarian principles is defensible, Rothbard's anti-state anarchic position is seriously undermined. The Rothbard-Nozick tension is merely one aspect of a larger dispute within the libertarian camp. While all parties to the dispute are keen to defend the claim that the free market is either the proper or the best way to provide for the range of services that human beings need, they differ on the critical question of the provision of those services that are often held to be the core services of government, the creation and maintenance of order, and the preservation of the peace via a resolution of disputes. The term minarchism was coined by Samuel Konkin in 1971 to apply to those libertarians who believe that compulsory government in some form is necessary. Minarchists believe that the free market can provide all the services human beings require except the core functions of government. Anarchists believe that all services, including the allegedly core functions of government, are sustainable without the use of a coercive agency, exercising a monopoly of legitimate force over a specified geographical area. Nozick's theory, then, is a paradigm example of minarchism. While it might seem to be a mere matter of historical detail, Rothbard believes it to be theoretically important to ask whether any state has actually come into being by means of the Nozickian process. With all the available evidence apparently pointing in the other direction, Rothbard judges that the answer to this question has to be in the negative. He writes, "Every state where the facts are available originated by a process of violence, conquest, and exploitation." One may wonder whether Rothbard's opinion in this matter is in fact historically accurate. One thinks, for example, of Switzerland and Vatican City. However, despite these possible exceptions, and one would have to admit that Switzerland and Vatican City are not your standard state, the history of the majority of states, if not of all states, supports Rothbard's opinion. The practical effect of this for Nozick's position, according to Rothbard, is that no actual state is in fact justified, since none of them has arisen via the prescribed Nozickian process. He believes that Nozick, to be consistent, should join with him in calling for the abolition of all existing states. Only then could we see whether or not a minimal state would inevitably come into being without violating anyone's rights. Whatever misgivings one might have about Nozick's project as a whole, from a libertarian perspective it cannot be denied that it starts with the right question. Why not, asks Nozick, have anarchy? Since anarchist theory, if tenable, undercuts the whole subject of political philosophy, it is appropriate to begin political philosophy with an examination of its major theoretical alternative. He adds, wryly, that those who consider anarchism not an unattractive doctrine will think it possible that political philosophy ends here as well. As I've already indicated, Anarchy, State and Utopia is notorious for its no-hold-barred statement of rights. I repeat the ringing announcement from the start of the book. Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating those rights. So strong and far-reaching are those rights that they raise the question of what, if anything, the state and its officials may do. How much room do individual rights leave for the state? Having such a conception of rights, Nozick has to be able to justify the coming into being of a minimal state. Can he do this? It looks as if he has got himself into a Humpty Dumpty situation where not all the king's horses nor all the king's men can get to where he wants to go from where he starts. This is where the notorious chapter, Prohibition, Compensation and Risk, of Anarchy, State and Utopia comes into play. In this chapter, Nozick, for no immediately obvious reason, significantly weakens his conception of rights. Rights were to be originally thought of as absolute barriers against the actions of others. Quote, there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. Now, however, it turns out that even if Tom has a right against Dick, that Dick not interfere with his pizza eating, nonetheless Dick can so interfere provided he's willing to compensate Tom in some way. This surprising turn of events depends on yet another distinction, one between property rules, which are absolute, and liability rules, which are not. Property rules are non-compensable. Liability rules are. Eric Mack remarks that the view that rights in themselves are claims protected by liability rules does not comport well with the overall tone of Anarchy, State and Utopia. Nozick does not begin this work by declaring that there are things that may not be done to individuals unless, of course, they are duly compensated. It's hard to disagree with Mack's assessment, except perhaps to suggest that it may be understated. The reason for what Mack calls the surprising attenuation of Nozick's conception of rights becomes obvious in the remainder of Part 1 of Anarchy, State and Utopia. On the basis of the original strong conception of rights enunciated boldly at the start of that work, Nozick was not going to be able to get to his minimal state, so the conception of rights had to be modified. Now, if this surprising, or as I would prefer to call it, this ad hoc modification of rights is rejected, Nozick's project of justifying the minimal state is stopped dead in its tracks, regardless of any other deficiencies in his argument. In a state of libertarian nature, everyone has the right to resist and punish aggression. Of course, not everyone is in a position physically so to do, nor, even if such were physically possible, would it necessarily fit with the principle of comparative advantage and the division of labour for each man to be his own defender and avenger. So, just as with many services that we require, it is more than likely that some people will offer their services to others in the matter of protection and vindication, and thus protective agencies will emerge, much as in the last several hundred years the desire to protect oneself against the cost of catastrophic disasters has led to a system of pooling of risks that has resulted in the emergence of insurance agencies. Any individual may choose to exercise the right to defend and vindicate himself if he so chooses, but practically speaking, it makes economic sense for the non-specialist to pay others to provide such services for him. In the normal course of events, then, a plurality of protective agencies will arise, each offering a range of services at a range of prices, and which protective agency, if any, one selects to protect one will depend upon normal commercial and personal considerations. Where an aggressor and the one aggressed against both belong or subscribe to the same protective agency, then any dispute is resolvable internally. What happens if the aggressor and the one aggressed against belong or subscribe to different agencies? Well, it's possible that the matter might be resolved by violence, but given the high transaction costs of violence, both to the agencies involved and eventually to their clients, it is highly unlikely that agencies would voluntarily choose to take this path. It is much more likely that an interagency dispute will be referred to a third party for resolution. Nozick contends that such appeals to a third party will lead inevitably to the emergence of a unified federal judicial system, of which all the protective agencies are mere components. Rothbard takes issue with Nozick on this very point. He writes, "The fact that every protective agency will have agreements with every other to submit disputes to particular appeals courts or arbitrators does not imply one unified federal judicial system. Nozick's argument commits a basic logical fallacy. Just as from every wife's having a husband, it doesn't follow that there is some one particular man who is husband to every woman, so too, if every intra-agency dispute is referred to a third-party arbiter, it doesn't follow that there has to be some one specific third-party arbiter to which every dispute is referred. Even in our present non-libertarian society, there are thousands of non-state arbiters making a living by resolving disputes. Indeed, so clogged is the state court system that many corporations include a private arbitration clause in their contracts in an effort to avoid inevitable delays. Nozick believes that there is something special about the provision of protection services that militates against the emergence and continuing existence of different agencies. He writes, "Unlike other goods that are comparatively evaluated, maximal competing protective services cannot coexist. The nature of the service brings different agencies not only into competition for customers' patronage, but also into violent conflict with each other. However, the evidence of history and contemporary experience shows Nozick's thesis of the inevitability of the emergence of a dominant protective agency to be indefensible. In Europe for many hundreds of years, multiple overlapping and competing legal jurisdictions competed and cooperated, most having no connection with the state's coercive apparatus. And even today, the existence of thousands of arbitrators, lawyers, private protection agencies, and insurance companies testifies to the viability of having multiple agents and agencies competing to provide insurance, arbitration, and protection services. If a natural monopoly were to emerge anywhere, it should surely emerge in the area of insurance, but in fact there is a significant amount of competition between rival insurance companies and no indication that a super insurance agency either has or must inevitably emerge. There is every market incentive for different agencies not to compete aggressively with one another and to work out in advance of any actual disputes how these would be resolved. There is no more a necessary momentum towards one super agency than there is towards any natural monopoly. The same rules apply here. If the super agency that arose through natural monopoly supplies its services well and at a reasonable rate, competitors are kept out by market forces. If the super agency starts to provide a poor service or to increase its charges significantly, then competitors will enter the field and, unless driven from it by force, for example by a protostate, will provide the necessary competition to keep the quality of services up and prices down. There is no antecedent reason to think that in some special way the provision of defence and justice is, unlike everything else, a natural monopoly. Nozick's argument then falls at the first hurdle. While it is always possible that a dominant protective agency could in fact emerge, there is no inevitability about such an event occurring, and, as we have seen, given normal competitive pressure, every likelihood that it will not in fact occur. For the sake of argument, let's grant Nozick his first step and move on to a consideration of the second. How does one get from a dominant protective agency to an ultra-minimal state? The story here is that the dominant protective agency, observing that remaining small-time operators engage in risky procedures against its clients, would have the right to prohibit such procedures, and in so doing, it would take on the mantle of a state, albeit an ultra-minimal state, whose remit extended solely to security issues. Now, while it is easy to see why an agency might have at least an interest and possibly some rights in respect of the activities of other agencies that bear upon its clients, we might well wonder why the dominant protective agency should have any particular rights where the alleged risky behaviour of the small-time operators does not involve its clients. Still more to the point, we might ask why, in cases of interagency conflict, the dominant agency should have the right, as distinct from the power, to prohibit the risky procedures of the small-timers and not vice versa. After all, if there are risks involved in having multiple agencies, and there would appear to be such risks, what of the risks involved in having a single agency with no competitors? It is at this point that the attenuated conception of rights not as an absolute barrier but only as prima facie compensable barriers, comes into play. The suggestion that those agencies whose activities are prohibited should be satisfied to be compensated by the dominant protective agency is untenable. What form will the compensation take? What amount of compensation will be offered? Who will be the judge of its adequacy? And what if no amount of compensation is acceptable? Why should the ultra-minimal state not simply do whatever it likes, to whomever it likes, in whatever way it likes, paying whatever kind and amount of compensation it likes? The only defensible answer to this question has to rest on the assertion of the basic libertarian principle of non-aggression. No one has the right to coerce anyone, not himself directly engaged in an overt act of aggression against rights. Once it's conceded that an agency has the right to use violence to prohibit risky behaviour by other agencies, there is no principled stopping place that can resist the extension of this concession, and the ultra-minimal state rather quickly becomes the minimal state. Nozick's second step, from the dominant protective to the ultra-minimal state, is unjustified. However, for the sake of argument, let us leave our objections to one side and consider Nozick's third step, from the ultra-minimal state to the minimal state. Nozick's argument here is that the ultra-minimal state is obliged to compensate the potential customers of the small-time agencies whose risky activities it has had to restrict by providing them with protective services, and in so doing, de facto, the minimal state emerges. Once again, the principal point concerning the insufficiency of compensation as the legitimation of criminal action is irrefutable. A willingness to make compensation is not, and it never can be, a justification of criminal action. It can be, at best, an attempt to restore the situation that existed before the crime was committed. My burglary of your house cannot be justified by my subsequent willingness to compensate you for your loss, particularly if I am to be the one who determines the method and quantity of compensation. Compensation, in the theory of punishment, is simply a method of trying to recompense the victim of a crime. It must in no sense be considered a moral sanction for the crime itself, writes Rothbard. Nozick himself would appear to have had some misgivings, remarking that a system permitting boundary crossing, provided compensation is paid, embodies the use of persons as means. Knowing that they are being so used, and that their plans and expectations are liable to be thwarted arbitrarily, is a cost to people. Some injuries may not be compensable, and for those that are compensable, how can an agent know that the actual compensation payment won't be beyond his means? But the key problem isn't only whether or not a given rights transgressor may not be able to afford compensation. It is rather whether or not compensation is antecedently acceptable to the one whose rights are transgressed. All this talk of compensation rests on the illegitimate assumption of commensurable utility scales. But if Austrian economics has shown anything to be beyond question, it is the ultimately subjective nature of people's value scales. The existence of only one fervent anarchist who could not be compensated for the psychic trauma inflicted on him by the emergence of the state, writes Rothbard, is enough by itself to scuttle Nozick's allegedly non-invasive model for the origin of the minimal state. For that absolutist anarchist, no amount of compensation would suffice to assuage his grief. Rothbard adopts Roy Child's brilliant Nozick in reverse argument, in which Childs demonstrates that if we were to start with the minimal state, the invisible hand would lead us inexorably to the ultra-minimal state, and the same process would take us from the ultra-minimal state to the dominant protective agency, and thence to a plurality of agencies, no one of which is necessarily dominant. Let's start with the assumption that we have a minimal state. Now let another agency which mirrors the procedures of the minimal state come into being. By hypothesis, the activities of this new agency cannot be any riskier than those of the minimal state. The new agency can charge less for its services, since the minimal state, as distinct from the ultra-minimal state, has to pay compensation to those who would have used agencies with risky procedures. Since these compensation payments are not legally mandatory, the minimal state, now under pressure from its competitor, is more likely than not to cease making them. In doing so, it ceases to be a minimal state and becomes an ultra-minimal state. Those who are in receipt of compensation can now choose to patronize the new agency. If the price differential disappears, as is likely to happen if the formerly minimal state ceases having to provide the payment of compensation, the new agency will have to differentiate itself from the now ultra-minimal state by other means, such as the provision of better or different services. But there's nothing magical about the number 2. If there can be 2 such agencies, there can be a third, and if a third, then a fourth. The ultra-minimal state is now simply the dominant agency among a plurality of agencies. Since, however, there is no economic imperative, unsupported by coercion, that guarantees any business its dominant position, there is every likelihood that the owners and operators of the once minimal state, then ultra-minimal state, and now, for the moment, dominant protective agency, will be unable to maintain its market dominance vis-à-vis the new aggressive agencies, and instead of being first among equals, will simply become one among equals. The sinister minimal state is reduced by a series of morally permissible steps which violate the rights of no one to merely one agency among many. In short, the invisible hand strikes back, writes Giles. Rothbard then summarizes his argument against Nozick's argument. 1. No existing state has been immaculately conceived, and therefore Nozick, on his own grounds, should advocate anarchism and then wait for his state to develop. 2. Even if any state had been so conceived, individual rights are inalienable, and therefore no existing state could be justified. 3. Every step of Nozick's invisible hand process is invalid. The process is all too conscious and visible, and the risk and compensation principles are both fallacious and passports to unlimited despotism. 4. There is no warrant, even on Nozick's own grounds, for the dominant protective agency to outlaw procedures by independents that do not injure its own clients, and therefore it cannot arrive at an ultra-minimal state. 5. Nozick's theory of non-productive exchanges is invalid, so that the prohibition of risky activities, and hence the ultra-minimal state, falls on that account alone. 6. Contrary to Nozick, there are no procedural rights, and therefore no way to get from his theory of risk and non-productive exchange to the compulsory monopoly of the ultra-minimal state. 7. There is no warrant, even on Nozick's own grounds, for the minimal state to impose taxation. 8. There is no way, in Nozick's theory, to justify the voting or democratic procedures of any state. 9. Nozick's minimal state would, on his own grounds, justify a maximal state as well. And 10. The only invisible hand process on Nozick's own terms would move society from his minimal state back to anarchism. Nozick's admittedly ingenious attempt to justify the minimal state on libertarian principles fails. He can have a robust conception of rights, rights that guarantee that there are things that no one may do to another without violation. Or he can have a minimalist state. He cannot have both. Summary. Robert Nozick's defense of libertarianism in Anarchy State and Utopia created a sensation in the normally sedate world of academic philosophy. Nozick starts off Anarchy State and Utopia with a bang. Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. So strong and far-reaching are these rights that they raise the question of what, if anything, the state and its officials may do. How much room do individual rights leave for the state? Before giving his argument to establish the minimal state, Nozick significantly weakens his conception of rights. Rights were to be originally thought of as absolute barriers against the actions of others. Now, even if Tom has a right against Dick that Dick not interfere with his actions, nonetheless Dick can so interfere provided he's willing to compensate Tom in some way. Nozick's argument then falls at the first hurdle. While it is always possible that a dominant protective agency could in fact emerge, there is no inevitability about such an event's occurring, and, as we've seen, given normal competitive pressure, every likelihood that it will not in fact occur. It is at this point that the attenuated conception of rights not as absolute barriers but only as prima facie compensable barriers, comes into play. The suggestion that those agencies whose activities are prohibited should be satisfied to be compensated by the dominant protective agency is untenable. A willingness to make compensation is not, and never can be, a justification of criminal action. It can be, at best, an attempt to restore the situation that existed before the crime was committed. Nozick's admittedly ingenious attempt to justify the minimal state on libertarian principles fails. He can have a robust conception of rights that guarantee that there are things that no one may do to another without violation, or he can have a minimal state. He cannot have both.